In the beginning, we were alone. We were an indivisible essence, coextensive with the universe, boundless in our energy, expanding as infinity must. We were without form. We were without light and without darkness. We were without sound and without silence. We knew neither time nor dimension. We were self-creators. We were everything that had ever existed. The origin of everything we considered to be. We filled the universe. We accorded ourselves with neither name nor identity. We were as a vapor filling the cosmos. We held neither articulated thoughts nor explicit beliefs. We were eternal and infinite. In our diffusion, we were sublime. We never questioned the fact of our existence, nor asked if there was a possibility of anything else. We were all that there was, or ever would be. We had no premonition of alternatives. We drifted for aeons amid our assumptions. We were never bored, nor challenging, nor elated, nor frustrated. We never spoke to each other in any sense that you might recognize. We communicated intuitively, silently, and perfectly. We were blind, because there was nothing to see. However, as soon as extraneous elements entered our realm, we saw them surely enough. And what elements they proved to be: a cataclysm. They crashed out of nowhere into our quiescence, and spoke all around us. They were certainly different from us. They had manifestations which had shape and texture and color and structure. They were identifiable, they moved detectably, and they were many. They gave us a new meaning to the universe, and they called themselves gods. Their thinking was radically different from ours, not least in that they were explicitly reasoned and articulated their thoughts. They had an extraordinary cataclysmic effect on us. They soon had us thinking too, and their thoughts were of a different order to ours. They believed in hierarchy and in creation. They wanted to create something and then to rule it. We watched them for many millennia before we disclosed our existence to them. They believed themselves to be the first creations of the universe, just as we had. "How many are there of you?" they asked us, frightened and surprised when we finally burst in on them. "We are infinite," we replied. "Do you have a leader?" "We have no leader." "You don't have someone who makes decisions on behalf of you all?" "We are one, and we have no decisions to make." "What would you have us to decide? What would you do? What should we do?" "We are."
The following program is closed captioned for the thinking impaired.
That is actually not a passage from the Nag Hammadi library, although it could be confused for one, for it is in the same vein as the paraphrase of Shem, the three stellas of Seth, or the second discourse of the great Seth. Yet this is a classic Gnostic Pre-Creation narrative from a virgin fiction novel entitled Fishing for Christians by Tim Roux, our astral guest in this eternal now.
A more perfect stage could not be asked for.
And what a beginning to an edgy, philosophical, and meditative contemporary gospel dealing with many theological thorns we all have to wear in our limited human incarnations. The most important thorn is the central theme of this Aeon Byte program, broadcast at the Virtual Alexandria on this approximately Saturday, November 15th, 2008. And that is the concept of suffering through the Gnostic microscope.
I believe that as a species, human beings define their reality through misery and suffering.
Fishing for Christians is a highly suggested work that echoes Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead, Philip K. Dick's religious sci-fi, although less ontological, the doctrinal musings and style of Neil Gaiman, or even a serious Terry Pratchett. After all, we continue a tradition at Aeon Byte of interviewing fiction writers who offer a new wrinkle to an old esoteric face. Every serious artist is already half a Gnostic, and we want to make sure here at the Virtual Alexandria that they get a voice and hopefully complete the loop. And it shouldn't even be mentioned anymore that writing, painting, poetry, and other crafts are great vehicles for spiritual mindfulness and growth.
If we live our lives the right way, then every single thing we do becomes a work of art.
We're all familiar with the reasons for suffering in other faiths. The Judeo-Christian worldview is pretty simple. Man commits the rather small infraction of eating some piece of fruit, and the whole of creation deflates into an adulterated state that not even God's brutal murder of his Son seems to affix. Yes, from black holes, supernovas, dark matter, crashing galaxies, natural disasters, all the way to cancer, viruses, allergies, and the show Full House are all because of a simple Epicurean infraction.
In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
And that include man's misuse of free will, lack of wisdom or compassion throughout history, and continuous joy in hurting himself and others. Makes little sense, but then it makes less sense when metaphysical cards are handed to you like, God works in mysterious ways, but he's still in charge. God is playing hide and seek, but he still has a plan. Satan did it. We have free will, and only the blessed don't get swept away by tsunamis. And a whole deck that leaves most individuals trapped in a state of ethereal schizophrenia, since the house wins more than we can at the table.
You shall know that God is God, and bow down to his will.
You know how it goes. God saved us from Katrina, but who was responsible for Katrina in the first place? Praise Jesus. It's an arrogant doctrine of suffering that gives men full responsibility for a vast, infirm microcosm, all because of an ancestor's poor choice and a talking snake.
And we can't argue with destiny now, can we?
Islam takes a similar viewpoint with a few variants. Hinduism sees the universe as a recycled galactic game, with karma weighing down every form of existence like hastily eaten Pakistani food. Do the time, or more like the times, and you'll leave the dream of Vishnu. Yet in another tradition, Krishna created the universe in order to know himself. Remember that explanation as we continue my jabberwocky, please.
Some people lose their faith because heaven shows them too little. But how many people lose their faith because heaven shows them too much?
Buddhism is far more pragmatic. It doesn't bother with the cause, but only the solution. Like the Buddha once said, if you're on your path and are struck by an arrow, you don't analyze the arrow to see what kind of wood it is, what feathers were used, perhaps from what direction it came from. No, you run to the nearest healer and get that arrow out, and then continue on your merry way. Don't worry about that arrow anymore. Worry about the path and your healing wound. Karma may take you down that path again, but you hope for the best.
But what does that mean, Buddha?
In Western Orthodoxy, we just assume the arrow is our fault and keep it for the rest of the journey until an emotional gangrene goes all the way into our hearts. The Gnostics agreed with Buddha that life was suffering and a grand illusion, closer though to the Greek ethos that life was a tragedy and we were all under the vain spell of gods and destiny.
God bless those pagans.
Yet the Gnostics added the notion that, like the Hindus, we housed a divine essence higher than anything of this dimension, except that instead of being shackled by karma, the divine essence was kidnapped by forgetfulness, ignorance, and arrogance, the same qualities we shared with the gods. Unlike Buddhism, The Gnostics decided that it was important to analyze that arrow that struck us on our path. Not just the arrow, but all the details, including the depth of the injury, nature and intention of the shooter of the missile, even the way the wind danced when you were struck. The path of ascent is the same as the path of descent, says the secret book of John. As above, so below, said Hermes Trismegistos, speaking through Apollonius of Tyana. And once you figured out all about the arrow and the shooter, don't go against them, for fighting the Empire means becoming the Empire. But you would find alternative paths to the end of your journey into being released from the wheel of space and time and into Godhood itself. And have compassion and forgiveness for the shooter.
Go in peace, sin no more, I'm out of here!
Can we do anything about suffering? Both the Buddha and the Gnostics and the Greeks and many Christians and Jewish thinkers simply said, no, there is nothing we can do. Sorry. The sooner you accept this and the fraud that is your life, the sooner you can continue down that path out of the woods of perdition full of satanic archers. Be grateful for all that is temporal, including happiness and good fortune, but know that it is fleeting and there are greater sensations out there.
Welcome to the real world.
Tim's book, Fishing for Christians, explains the beginning of suffering much in the same way some Gnostic Gospels, Kabbalah schools, and Hermetical philosophies do. Before the beginning, there was just being, and everything was fine. Then there was an awareness. The being, the it, the ultimate source, suddenly became aware. As soon as it was aware, it had to break from itself in order to understand itself. The all fell into a process of hopeless duality. It was majestic and awesome indeed, yes, but the mere fact there was a separation, a fragmentation, was the ultra-genesis, or at least set the stage from the ultra-genesis of suffering.
Rosebud.
The birth pangs of the universe, as St. Paul calls it. Perfection stretched itself so far in its endless analysis of itself, perfection became diluted. And then, depending on the tradition or scripture, there was either a cosmic cataclysm or a simple devolution into the reality we are all trapped in.
You're all going to die down here.
And there is nothing we can do to change it, my beloved truth seekers. Let me put it in a different way. Like the protagonist of the Gnostic film, The Nines, says when he first experiences his first inning of Gnosis, there is something wrong with this world. So simple. There is something wrong with this world. And then he is told by a benign archon that this illusion, the Black Iron Prison, is not really a dream, not death, not a coma, not a lapse in time and space. No, it's as real as anything can be real. That is our world. And suffering has been hopelessly sewn into it because the way it was designed, or its distance from the sacrosanct fountainhead.
Do you ever get tired of watching bad things happen to people? That's crazy talk.
Reality is fine, perhaps. It is us, or actually part of us, that is allergic to the material world. The ancients understood this. The core teachings of most religions understand this. And Gnosticism has its own unusual take that understands this. Tim Roux' Fishing for Christians also adds new angles on the cosmology and cosmology of creation. The ultimate existence is called, like many Gnostics called it, the living God. When the living God became aware, a temptation factor sprouted from within called the devil. The living God is the living God, but Barbelo or Sophia or the Logos have been replaced by a similar type of curious trickster, in this case the devil. No matter, being is not enough then. There must be creation, exploration, and understanding of all possibilities of existence.
If I were creating a world, I wouldn't mess about with butterflies and daffodils. I would have started with lasers. 8 o'clock, day one.
Thus the devil then creates the gods of all mankind's known pantheons, or demiurges as Tim calls them, who in turn begin creating countless worlds, dimensions, and dreams, humans and other life forms, in order to find every contingent outcome or development.
We are the Matrix. We create order from chaos.
Suffering, by default, of course, permeates the whole experiment simply because it is an experiment. But it seems the living God, the devil, and the demiurge are fine watching it continue until a perfect formula appears, a celestial utopia where every calculation, every interaction, every motion of every atom is in perfect harmony, and thus a return to the state of being, but reconciled with that sense of awareness. Paradise regained, in other words.
I am the supreme being. I'm not entirely dim.
That is but a small biology of fishing for Christians, pregnant with angels and archangels, fearsome demons and supernaturally gifted humans, and so much more. Tim takes the more Hindu style in understanding suffering in the end, but he certainly makes the case for the Gnostic point of view.
As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
The difference between fishing for Christians and the Gnostic slant is that the Gnostic knows the experiments. This dank laboratory called the universe will never find the holy petri dish or perfect formulation. Perhaps my old heretic friends, the Buddha, the Greeks, and I are all wrong. We'll see. But the individual solution is and always will be Gnosis. There is something wrong with this world, it begins, and thus begins the Bantam death march back to the treasury of light. We see the world as it is, an etch-a-sketch of darkness trapping light. We begin the butchery that is self-knowledge, understanding that we are hollow lies, deceiving holographs, and mild-mannered Frankensteins.
All I've ever known to be true is a lie.
And from within and without, using the teaching and mysteries imparted to us by the apostles of light, the pleroma drips into the cosmos. We begin mending, balancing, and healing all that is infected by the nightmares of Saklas, the childish god. We detach from the world of forms and put forth all qualities, memories, and situations before us without judgment, and hold all those polarities up so that they may be harmonized.
I'm going to show you a world without sin.
And then we shall begin sensing the quark of divinity deep within the warrens of our soul. Something is wrong with this world. We'll keep saying in this illusion that is more real than anything out there because it is just diluted perfection. And the quark will throb and glow like a dragon heart. Of course I'm being simple and perhaps simplistic, but that is the only way we'll defeat suffering. Suffering doesn't make us stronger. Wanting to escape us makes us stronger. And the only way to escape suffering is to transcend this universe. Become passerbyers, like the Gospel of Thomas says. Become Christ, like the Gospel of Philip says. See through the fog of ignorance and behold the all, as the Gospel of Truth says. Or again, as the Gospel of Thomas says, Jesus said, "Those who have found themselves, of them the world is not worthy." Or also Jesus says, "Damn the flesh that depends on the soul. Damn the soul that depends on the flesh." Or like the first apocalypse of James says, "Cast away from your blind thought this bond of flesh which encircles you." Or as the apocalypse of Paul simply says, "Let your minds awaken." There is something wrong with this world, said the protagonist of the movie The Nines. Are you getting that you shouldn't be around for that suffering now that your eyes are opening? Or are you going to fall back into the machine and pretend you actually have a place in the emptiness of the universe where you float on a speck of dust?
Billions of people just living out their lives, oblivious.
But enough of my drivel. Let us explore Tim Roux and his excellent work, Fishing for Christians, and understand suffering and some other very powerful spiritual themes. Today we have the pleasure of having Tim Roux to discuss his wonderful book, Fishing for Christians. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Miguel, thank you.
What were you trying to do when you set out on writing Fishing for Christians?
Well, I think I was trying to do three things, and the first one was purely literary. Fishing for Christians fits actually into 6 books. There's actually a sextet, which is called the End of the World Sextet. And so, in a literary sense, I'm trying to link it into the schema of the 6 books and to fit it in with other books. And particularly one called Girl on a Barstool, which is like a prequel to Fishing for Christians, which is about the Second Coming, fundamentally, whereas even more fundamentally about brand marketing. But it's the idea of God returning to earth to try and correct some of the mismessages that have been happening, horrified by what human beings have done with his religion, and repeating, in a sense, what he did last time round of getting himself executed in order to publicize a message which is sort of sympathy and empathy for our situation. So, and there are a couple of characters in that book which actually are also in Fishing for Christians, although I don't think I ever actually say so explicitly. And then, so the first thing was to try and fit it into the schema of the other books. And then after that, my fundamental question, as in all the other books, I'm looking at the issues that most interest me in life. And the fundamental question in terms of Fishing for Christians is the classic one of why do people suffer? Or why does a loving God allow people to suffer? And I think I got into religion, I suppose, initially when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and it struck me even then that there wasn't really a very good answer to that question. And sort of 50 years later, nearly, I'm still trying to find the answer to that question. And you get some answers like, well, non-answers like, he works in mysterious ways, which doesn't really answer much.
No, not really.
And then you get the one that says, it's really a part of the teaching process, but it a bit beats me. If a baby dies after 3 days of starvation, I'm not quite sure what it's learned in the process.
Right.
And I can't believe God's that bad a teacher. So that's my core question in all this, is why would a loving God allow people to suffer? Then the third thing I was trying to address was the whole issue of religion in its entirety, and the issue of multiple religions and how we react to it. And 100 years ago, we were all fundamentalists. We all thought our religion was the only religion, and that anybody who didn't believe in our religion was bad, and it was therefore due for some torture or some imprisonment or some execution or whatever it was that one did to bad people. And I suppose there's still some fundamentalists around who still think their religion is the only religion that's worth bothering with. But I think most of us nowadays recognize there are many different religions, and all those religions have some sort of validity. And there are certain ways that you react to that. So one way is like a parallel religion, so you accept that there's Hinduism, there's Buddhism, there's various forms of Christianity, etc., etc. And you see them in parallel worlds, so whichever world you happen to be in, that is the religion, and you don't try in any way to bring them together. Then another reaction is that you do try to bring them together, so you do some form of ecumenical work, as often the different branches of Christianity, trying to bring Roman Catholicism closer to Protestantism, or Protestantism closer to Methodism, and so on. Another approach is a Parsi approach, which is that any religion is okay. And I think the Parsis are unique in saying every religion is good, we'll adopt anything we like out of any religion. And indeed, they can go into any church in the world and consider it a Parsi church. Strangely, it doesn't work the other way around. They don't actually let people into their own churches, but they can go anywhere else and worship. Or you can just create your own religion, which is what's happening quite a lot now in spiritualism. So you have, for instance, the whole angels and angel therapy, people like Doreen Virtue, who have the idea that at any time we have angels who are there to help us, and all we have to do is call upon them. So for instance, my wife actually has, or believes she has, or is told she has, 11 archangels looking after her, which probably shows how difficult I am to live with. And all you have to do, if you whatever you want, you call the angels in, and it's their job to help you out. And similarly, as you probably know, the law of attraction, the idea you have the source, and the source is there again to help you. All you have to do is throw your wish statement into the air, and then align yourself to that wish statement, and the world will follow you and will allow you to do what you want to do and get what you want. Too often, for my taste, it's a bit materialistic, and most people want exotic holidays and beautiful partners and lots of money and all that sort of thing, which seems to come out of the law of attraction. But nonetheless, they've created a religion around this idea of the source. And my idea was actually slightly different. My idea was, what if all religions are literally true? Not at some sort of abstract level of thought, but in terms of what they describe as having happened. As I looked for a scheme, basically, where you actually could slot lots of different religions structurally together. I discovered that, and this is purely starting from scratch. I wasn't trying to fit it in any particular way, but I discovered that Gnosticism had a structure which, to my mind, actually worked quite well for that. Because you have your God beyond God, what I call the living God, and then you have the demiurge, which in my case is the devil. Then you have in Gnosticism the demiurge's helpers, who confusingly I call the demiurges, who are the mythological gods, the Aztecs, the Greeks, the Incas, the Mesopotamian gods, the Norse gods, etc., etc. And then you have human beings and indeed all living creatures. And then around that you can build in other aspects like the angels, which come more out of spiritualism. Well, it obviously come out of other areas too, but there's a particular interest at the moment in the angels in terms of spiritualism. You can bring in reincarnation and so on. And I thought more or less that within that schema you actually can incorporate structurally nearly all the religions that exist. And so that's what I was trying to do at that point, was just simply to see how one could put religions together and find some commonality structurally across all religions, and then see what that took us.
What exactly was the reason? It's a beautiful introduction. I mean, you talk about the mind of the living God, as you call him. But what is the reason for the separation of the devil and the living God that begins the creation of the universe?
Well, the stories I tell it, I'm not even pretending it's true, it's a story, is that the living God, as I call him, is fundamentally passive. He's happy, it is happy to float around the universe being, and you usually have this sort of that Greek tripartite of being, thinking, and doing. So he's pretty happy on the being bit. And so he then creates the angels to be fellow beers. And so he and the angels are floating around happily, doing their own thing, expanding as infinity must, and this is all they want to do. And the living God believes that if you start doing things, and even to the sense start thinking things, you begin to run into trouble. People will get hurt, because you can't even make a step in any direction without the risk of standing on an ant or whatever. But there's a part of him who's curious. There's a part of him who says, is this it? Is this all we're going to do with all our intelligence? Just float? This is beach bum stuff. No, there must be more than this. And I want to know everything that is possible. What can intelligence do? And so this is it's sort of linked to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, basically. And God said, no, be quiet. No, this is fine, thanks. But this part of him persistently pushes, we must find out what is possible. And God basically resolutely rejects this. And so this part of him that says, I want to know more, gets expelled from the Godhead, if you like, and becomes the devil. So the devil is actually a temptation within God, if you like, to explore. And so the devil then goes off and he tries to create a method exploring everything in the end, every permutation that could possibly exist, infinite permutations. But he's actually not so good at creating stuff himself, so he actually then brings in the creator gods to actually try and find out how the world could be created.
Yes, so Tim, so the universe is basically one grand experiment by the devil to see how everything, like you said, all the different possibilities of creation. But the angels themselves overlook this experiment, right?
Well, they're observers to the experiment, and they, according to the story, they don't even know God exists. They're floating around happily, and they have, in fact, they don't really think much at all that they just are.
Yeah, they have no contact with the living God, I think.
And that's right. They have speculations all around. They have speculations later on. They have speculations as the living God. They think something must have created them, but they never actually had any real contact apart from Lucifer, who does later on. So they are observing, and then they're shocked when these creator gods suddenly turn up, because the creator gods are sort of busy people or busy creatures, and they're noisy, and it's a bit like having a quiet afternoon, and suddenly a whole mass of people turn up with screeching guitars and loud music and motorbikes, and so they're thoroughly disrupted by these guys turning up. And so, and more than just then they become disgusted and indeed wish to just go away and even die. But of course, the creator gods are here to stay. So they've given themselves a role basically of trying to console the unhappy victims of this experiment, which are human beings and other living creatures who are on the wrong end of all this. That then generates in the angels two ways of reacting to that. And so basically I have the Archangel Michael on the one side and the Archangel Lucifer on the other. And the Archangel Lucifer really is a classic revolutionary. He says, no, this is all wrong. we can't have all this suffering. No possible end could justify these means. And so they just wrap the whole thing up. Of course, he can't do that. The angels have no power to do that. But he's arguing that the whole thing should be wrapped up. Let's find the living God and let's tell the living God that this isn't worth it. End of story. The Archangel Michael is much more of a corporatist, much more of a pragmatist. And he says, no. If we are ever to get to paradise, and paradise doesn't seem a bad thing, then in the nature of innovation, things will go wrong. So the only way we can ever get from A to Z is through all the other letters in the alphabet. And so this sort of thing has to happen. This experiment has to go forward so that in the end of the day, we know, or not we know, but something knows how to put everything right and how you have the perfect paradise. And so there's this big debate between Lucifer and Michael as to how to proceed. And eventually Michael basically just challenges Lucifer and says, get down to earth, take some angels with you, and you from first-hand experience, you see what is happening down there, and so you can help whoever's doing all this understand how to create paradise. So in my version, Lucifer is not a fallen angel in the classic sense at all. He's an angel who comes to Earth to try and help the experiment in a sense, very reluctantly. He just wants the suffering to end. And equally in the same way, I don't want the devil to be seen as being bad, just as Woody Allen once described God as being sort of over-ambitious. And so he's not actually, the devil is not really doing a terrible thing, except for its consequences.
Right, and it must be noted for the listener that Lucifer and the devil are two distinct creatures.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And Lucifer actually goes down to Earth, and it also must be noted, which was, I thought, a good way of fitting in all these, like huge hierarchies of gods and pantheons and all these other odd creatures, is that there is no one Earth. There's almost an infinite number of Earth with different possibilities, right?
Well, and the idea behind that is if you want to create an experiment which is looking for the infinite permutations, you then also have to have infinite dimensions. And those infinite dimensions could be this infinite number of planets which have life on them, potentially. But the way I described it was that would be too complex to write about, to be honest. That's the reason why it isn't that. But so in my version, the devil very conveniently, or indeed the gods very conveniently, failed really to kick off the same complexity of life on other planets as they did on Earth. And so the devil said, right, okay, that's a wrap. We've got it going on Earth. Right, let's now recreate the Earth in infinite dimensions. And so you have the same experiment. It's basically about counterfactuals. You can't, in one dimension, undo what has been done and see what would have happened differently. So what you have going here is now in infinite dimensions, everything can be possible unaffected by what's happening in other dimensions. So you can have what are technically known as counterfactuals. You can have the same situation play out a different way because there is a different background to it.
Lucifer is the only one who speaks to the living God, and that is when the living God actually manifests themselves down on Earth. In your book, why does the living God come down into material form? He doesn't do it to die for our sins, let's put it that way.
No, he doesn't, no. The living God, the calculation of the living God is ultimately calculation. He, she, it is looking on the Earth, appalled by what is happening, to be honest. Really wishes this were not the case. Not really appalled by human beings, and of course, what else do human beings do within this experiment but go along with the experiment? Right. So there's no good and evil. There's no part of mea culpa, I'm a terrible human being, I deserve to suffer or anything. God is very much in total sympathy and empathy for all living creatures as being on the butt end of this experiment. So he comes down to Earth because he thinks it's important that he experiences every aspect of Earth. So the idea is he's actually been to the different dimensions of the Earth many times. As all sorts of different creatures, as rocks, as stones, as trees, as ducks, or whatever. So it's not as if he doesn't quite regularly manifest in various forms, but he is very, very, very reluctant to interfere because he knows that the calculation is even beyond his brain as to what will happen as a consequence. Because you have the primary law of wrongful consequences that you do one thing and something else happens. So you find an unhappy house painter in Vienna and you cheer him up and he becomes Hitler. Now you don't want to do that sort of thing. So God has the humility, if you like, not really to wish to interfere, but he does want the experience, and so he manifests as Jesus the Christ in that particular case, and then later on as another character who comes out of Girl on the Barstool, and it is really for him to learn the experience of what it's like to be a human being, more than anything, and then to express empathy and sympathy with our suffering, and along the way to give a point of view, which is above all love, ultimately, in one word. And he picks out Lucifer because Lucifer is probably most attuned to God's own thinking. And God's horrified by what's happening, Lucifer's horrified by what's happening, and so there is a very strong affinity between Lucifer and God.
And it must be mentioned in your book, Tim, that there is no real heaven or hell. Everything is eternally reincarnated, right?
That's right. And basically the whole universe is populated by universal infinite souls. And so in the different levels, you have God, who's an infinite intelligence in his own right, obviously. He creates the angels, who are a very similar form. He creates the angels in his own image, more or less. So there's a very similar form of infinite intelligence. You have the devil, who comes from God. God creates the creator gods, who are another form of infinite intelligence. The creator gods then have their progeny, Zeus and all the various other people, Quetzalcoatl and so on. And even the human beings are, I borrow the concept of the wise ones, which you may have come across in various spiritualism.
Right.
Who are, again, they're basically us, they're ourselves. So you and me, we are one manifestation in one plane. And at the same time, as I give the examples, Miguel, you're doing this wonderful work here for Aeon Byte, but in another dimension, you're a tree frog. One after that, you're something else. You're a microbe, and one after that, you're a hairdresser. So
I'm one soul experiencing all these infinite possibilities.
Yes,
basically.
Exactly. That's all part of that process. Exactly. So everything is infinite.
What the very humorous thing in your book is when you have this great convention of gods. What was the purpose of this convention?
Well, cynically, the purpose of this convention is actually to have a war at the end of it. But the idea is basically the devil has basically created a committee to create the worlds. And he ends up with Earth in its different dimensions, and so the Earth in its different dimensions is ruled by all our favourite mythological gods. So, the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Incas, and so on. Their job, although again this is somewhat implicit, is to create these infinite possibilities. And the one thing they're not allowed to do is mess it up, is to actually bring the Earth to an end. And they've nearly done that a few times round. When the dinosaurs were wiped out, they very nearly did it 10,000 years ago or whatever. With the great floods, if they happened, then they probably needed it again. And here they are at it again. So this is like a peace conference, although they regularly meet. It's not as if it's occasional. It's a regular thing. But in this case, say cynically, the idea is that it had to come down to a war in order to end the world. And the battle lines this time round are drawn between the gods of the developed world, who are in this dimension are representing basically the West, that has amassed good fortune unto itself and is living the great life, but also burning up resources at a horrifying rate. And against those gods, you have the gods of the developing world, who think that by the time they get to life, with nothing left, the oil would have run out, all resources would have gone, the earth would have warmed to a point where it potentially would no longer sustain life. And so the convention is a regular thing. The gods get together, they give the leaders of the world their marching orders that they forget they're being given, but they go and follow it at Davos and try and work out the will of the gods. And then in terms of the book, the idea is that all wars that happen on Earth are a reflection of wars between the gods. If Zeus becomes unhappy with Quetzalcoatl, he's not allowed to punch him on the nose. He has to go and do the equivalent on the Earth. And then when Quetzalcoatl equivalent on the Earth has been punched in the nose, then Quetzalcoatl has to retaliate by punching somebody else on the Earth who's a representative of Zeus. That sort of concept. So all the wars that ever happened have been reflections of some level of disunity amongst the gods, as was believed in Greek times, that wars were very heavily driven by the gods.
Yeah, and what I like, Tim, is that it definitely ties right into Gnosticism, because, as you mentioned, the gods, like the archons of Gnosticism, are, when it comes down to it, if you look past their swagger, they're basically fearful, ignorant, and arrogant, aren't they?
Yeah, well, and again, the gods are playing two games here. One is they have they fit into the scheme, but also they are an allegory for world leaders. and I think that your description probably fits them pretty well.
Right,
in both categories. And so they are there to exemplify. I can't say I've actually met any world leaders, but I've read about them quite a few times. I met a few CEOs. The arrogance, the pomposity, the expectation of service, and so on. The egotism, megalomania, whatever. They are sort of human beings writ large, if you like. That's why they're there. Oh, sorry, actually, one of the things to comment on that is, in writing it, I was aware of that I was calling what a Gnostic Christian would call the devil, Freud would call the demiurge. I was calling the devil, because I wanted to make the point about the devil not being sulphurous with horns and so on, and the pitchfork. And obviously, I also changed the whole piece about the demiurge's helpers, where I slotted in all the different mythological gods, rather than I think it's five. Isn't it about five planets in Gnosticism, including Lucifer?
There's,
I think.
7 planets.
7 planets, is it? Right, okay.
7 heavens, and in one there's the 8th heaven, the Ogdode. Yeah, it changes. The Gnostics always change their stories.
I hope so.
That's the beauty about them. They always tinkered with things. One thing I also really liked about the book, Tim, is in one chapter, Michael is he's ruminating about perfection. What is perfection? What would the perfect life be for each one of us? And it pretty much comes to a dead end, doesn't it? Because, like suffering, perfection is one of those concepts that's pretty subjective. It's impossible to get your mind around it, right?
Well, yes. There's an experiment somewhere. I can't remember who did it, but they in some university, and it might be Harvard or whatever. I'm not quite sure who did it, but they regularly ask their brainiest students to try and describe paradise. And every single time, they end up describing the Earth as it is, but better. People can't get away from the structure that already exists. And that is sort of the issue I was trying to address there, that if you actually start from scratch, if you're trying to forget what is, where do you get to? And Michael, in that case, is having as much difficulty as anybody else is in trying to work out what would paradise be. It's the old thing, don't mention pink elephants, and then of course you think about pink elephants forever on. Right. You get stuck within that framework.
So basically, perfection is just one of those things that is just a point of view when it comes down to it. I mean, we can't even say the living God is perfection either.
Well, yes, and in the book, in a sense, where it comes down in the end is to say that there's perhaps one thing above all else that would make the world a very, very, very different place, and that is if the manifestations of these souls, the people, if you like, or creatures, were indestructible. If we didn't have to eat, if in fact we were incapable of killing anything else, because that something else is incapable of being killed, that would create a completely different world. And it might be perceived as being a form of perfection, or at least a different way of seeing the experiment. So paradise, as it happens in the end, is one where people are utterly indestructible, and resources are infinite. So people are not. If you take the Marxist perspective, for instance, Marxists believe that all wars and most human activity is about a fight for limited resources. And so if you actually take that away, the limited resources, then perhaps people calm down a bit. Whereas the thinking before that happens is that the whole structure of the world is such that it's impossible to avoid suffering. Even if every human being behaved like a saint, you'd still have a pretty horrible world, because you wouldn't stop the animals eating each other. And who's to say that even if you eat a carrot, it's not actually doing damage to the carrot and so on. So absolutely built into the fabric of the world is suffering. And so unless you can take away that suffering, you don't even begin to address what some people might believe will be a better world, being closer to paradise. And of course, one thing, I stopped the book when paradise is created, because I can't imagine what it would look like either. So, and I'm sure God would have a better shot at it than I can. But no, I didn't want to go there, to be honest. But it would be a very interesting sequel one day, if anybody can think out what paradise would look like.
Right, and I guess the key is that the source or the concept of suffering is still open-ended. I mean, that we don't know, even in this paradise, if there will be suffering, or maybe it comes down to the conclusion that the mere fact that we exist, that we are aware, brings suffering, right?
Well, it's pretty clear that in this paradise there wouldn't be any physical suffering. You wouldn't starve, you wouldn't be hurt, you wouldn't die, you wouldn't, any of those sorts of things. But of course there could be anguish, there could be mental suffering. And this thinking is going back to, if I remember rightly, there's an African god called Atai. And in African, one of the African, obviously there are quite different African religions. In one of the African religions, there's the idea that God asked Atai to create war and dispute in order to keep human beings under control. So in that particular religion, it was the basis, it is war and fighting that actually stopped the world from being paradise. And it's like a sort of divide and rule policy. It was if the human beings all got together and agreed, then God might be in trouble. And so they had to create this division in order to make the world easier to rule by the gods.
Yes, and of course the gods are imperfect in their own ways. So through your research, your views on the cause of suffering, what did you learn anything writing the book, or through research, or where are you now versus where you were before?
Yeah, and the book was fundamentally a story, but it was very much driven by, is there any explanation which makes any sort of sense to me that could explain why suffering exists? And I'm reasonably comfortable with the idea that the world is an experiment. Find out what is possible, and you can't find out what is possible without suffering being an element of that. Otherwise, you're cutting out a huge part of the equation. So, in a sense, I think, at least for me, it satisfies me that this is one potential explanation as to why suffering exists. I'm not saying it's the explanation, I'm just saying it's one logical explanation. And it's, for me, a much better explanation than that we're here to learn. A lot of people nowadays see our earthly experience as a sort of a lifelong school, and that we're here to learn, and at the end of it we then go off and perhaps we're reincarnated, or perhaps we go to heaven, or what we do, having learned something. I find that a slightly arrogant thought that the whole of the universe is created for human beings to learn. It sort of cuts out most of the rest of the living creatures. When it comes down to suffering, I think it's just an explanation that may or may not hold water. It holds water for me. That the whole thing is a massive experiment, and suffering has to be part of that experiment. Otherwise, something else, some other creature, some other entity, will not be able to understand the ultimate permutations of everything.
But are you talking about an experiment like in Hinduism? It says, Krishna created the universe to know himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you talking about exactly that? It's the divine working itself out.
Absolutely, yeah.
But in the end, that's I've always thought of suffering too, and it's still, you never get there, but you just have to find the closest thing you can, right? What makes you sleep through the night.
Where I come from, in a sense, is that I became first fascinated by religion when I was about 7 or 8 years old, because you had to go and do enough of it so you might well enjoy it. And at that point, I obviously the religion I was taught was Christianity, and what Christ was saying made a lot of sense to me, and I was pretty happy with that, and I'm pretty happy to this day with that. What horrified me was the religions in the end, the human version of those religions and what they do. And if you take God in his form of Jesus the Christ, what he was on about, it is absolutely a desecration what the formal religions have done to that. And this whole idea of you have to go around killing each other to create peace, or to impose the only view of God there is utterly bizarre. So I'm I would call myself a Christian, but not a Christian in a sense that involves the church, which is also why I find Gnosticism particularly attractive. Because in Gnosticism there isn't this sense of a formal church, and I think in my studies what I found fascinating was the whole thing of the Nicene Council. I think I was going back a bit. I was saying that as such I would not describe myself. I describe myself as a Christian because I fully go with Christ's central concept of love. But I'm pretty horrified by the other aspect, by what human beings and the churches have made of his religion, which is why I find Gnosticism particularly interesting, because he doesn't really have a church in that sense, or at least I don't think he has. And then the whole thing of the Nicene Council, and the way I see that is that it was a sellout basically, and that you basically that Constantine brought together a whole pile of bishops and said, "Are bishops important to the church? Are they critical to the conversation between human beings and God?" And as many people who's actually asking were bishops, they either had the chance of either voting themselves a job or not. And not surprisingly, they voted themselves a job, and so they brought in the whole aspects of the structure of the church, which they benefited from ever since, really. And so my sympathies are very much, in that sense, towards the Gnostics, that there should be a direct conversation between individual human beings and gods. But the other part of all that, really...
I would ask you, so you are a proponent of the concept of Gnosis. Have you ever experienced Gnosis?
What, direct conversation with God?
Yeah, that experience with the divine, that interaction with the divine.
Strangely enough, well, I can't say whether I have or haven't. I think every novelist would say, though, that when you write a book, something takes over.
Right, very true.
And actually, when I can't say what it is, but when I was writing this book, Fishing for Christians, for instance, I did have a sense that there was something guiding me. Now, whether that's complete rubbish or whatever, it could well be, but I had that sense. And what was more extraordinary in a way was, and try to go back on that, obviously you have this, but in Revelation, you have this interdiction by St. John to rewrite Revelation. Terrible things happen to you if you rewrite Revelation, apparently. And so, I was a little bit nervous. Nonetheless, I wasn't directly rewriting Revelation, but I was a bit looking over my shoulder, and I got the sense of, okay, Tim, carry on. This is worth doing. Have courage. And anyhow, I finished the book on a Friday night, and it's actually the day before the memorial service for one of my nieces who unfortunately died of breast cancer when she was 39, which is...
I'm sorry to hear that.
Earlier this year, and actually what was even sadder was that her younger sister died 2 years earlier of a disease. And so, I finished the Fishing for Christians last chapter on Friday night, and Saturday morning, just before the memorial service, I woke up with the first chapter of my next book, and I had not the slightest intention of writing a book at all at that point. I wanted the summer off, and this new book turned up, first chapter, totally in my head, and I wrote it down, and I hadn't a clue what it was about. And so I thought, well, I might as well carry on typing, and so I carried on typing, and I made my first plot decision 40,000 words in, and I only ever made 3 plot decisions in the whole book, and the whole thing just flew off the page. And so I also got a sense at that point it's almost like a thank you. you wrote Fishing for Christians, now have a freebie. And I say it's probably ridiculous self-aggrandizement, but that was a sort of genuine sense I got that I was being helped considerably by somebody somewhere. And now whether that's being helped by God or by ascended masters or by angels or by I haven't a clue whom, I don't know, but I do find, particularly when you're writing, but actually probably more generally nowadays, that there's some sort of entity around you that is trying to help you out, if you like. And it's not a sort of interactive conversation in that sense, but I do feel somewhat guided some of the time.
You're reaching a higher state of consciousness, which is what the Gnostics did here.
Yes,
touching upon a higher plane of existence and drawing from it. So, yeah, I can certainly relate. But I think that's all the time we have today, Tim. I think I'd like to thank you for coming on Aeon Byte and talking about your very stimulating book. Gives us a lot to think about.
Well, my great pleasure, of course. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you, Miguel.
Oh, no, thank you, and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Tim Roux helping us perhaps understand the notion of suffering, as well as giving us a Gnostic Gospel that, like all Gnostic Gospels, should open our eyes to how absurd our lives and the universe that is but a way station truly are. It's a good, sober read where Tim makes few judgment calls and leaves many questions for the reader to quarry. The Buddha said, "Suffering there is, but none that suffer." Honestly, I've never figured out what that means. I do get there is something wrong with this world, but suffering there is, but none that suffer has always eluded me. And before we depart and you hopefully write your own gospel to understand suffering, I'd like to point out that, unlike other faiths, the living God, the pleroma and its aeons, are not personal in any conventional sense. They really don't do much except what they do best, and that is being. Yes, they whisper into existence those apostles of light, those eternal champions, those messiahs and Buddhas and gurus, but that's about it. People have trouble understanding this, thinking that the ultimate perfection is going to micromanage the wastelands of the lower realms. Sorry, my beloved true seekers. I know that's hard to accept sometimes. The fullness of the divine just can't relate to our layers of deficiency. It's our job to go to the unknown Father and Mother instead of the other way around. Although a little perspective, sometimes we can turn things on its head. It's not totally our fault we're here, but it's almost fully our responsibility we make matters right. That's what separates a hero from a good person. A hero just does what he or she must do, regardless of who's to blame. And we are still the Gnostics, aren't we? We are veterans of 1,000 psychic wars and set the controls to the heart of the sun. We just can't understand why heresy is so much fun. We create our own systems, or as William Blake said, we will be trapped in the systems created by others. We are spiritual vigilantes, orphans of hell, and the burning feathers of Icarus. Suffering there is, but none that suffer. There is something wrong with this world. Or like Rousseau once said, I have suffered too much in this world not to hope for another. I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the God above God that can. The road is ended, the song is over. Thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that